Here, I only went over to drop off her jacket. That was the whole reason. Diane had left it in my car 3 days earlier, after we all grabbed dinner together, and I'd been meaning to return it since Tuesday but kept forgetting, until I finally just threw it in my passenger seat that Thursday morning, and told myself I'd drop it off on the way home from work. Here, it was around 7:30 when I pulled up to the house. The lights were on. Her car was in the driveway, so I figured it was fine, just a quick drop-off, 30 seconds. Maybe wave at Marcus through the window if he happened to walk by. I knocked twice and waited. Diane opened the door, and the first thing I noticed was that she wasn't herself. I'd known her for almost 4 years through my buddy Ryan, who'd introduced us at a backyard cookout the summer before she got married. She was always the person in the room who seemed like she had everything figured out. Good job, nice house, always the first one to laugh at something. The version of her standing in that doorway was none of that. Her eyes were red, not like she'd been crying recently, more like she'd been trying not to cry for the last several hours and was losing the fight. Her hair was pulled back but coming loose on one side. She was in a plain white t-shirt and joggers. She looked at me, then at the jacket in my hand and said, "Oh, right. Nothing else. Just that." I held it out. "Left this in my car Saturday. Sorry it took me so long." She took it without looking at it. There was a long pause where she stood, half behind the door, like she wasn't sure whether to let it close or keep holding it open. Then she said, "Marcus isn't here." "That's okay," I said. "I was just dropping it off." She nodded once. Her jaw was tight in a way that made me slow down instead of turning to leave. "You okay?" I asked. She laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. It was the kind that comes out when someone asks that question at exactly the wrong time, and the honest answer is too big to say out loud. "Come in for a second," she said. I should have said I couldn't. I had leftovers waiting at home, and a show I'd been meaning to catch up on, and absolutely no reason to walk into whatever was happening inside that house. But she looked like someone who'd been standing alone in a quiet room for too long. And something about that made me step through the door. The living room was neat, which felt wrong somehow. Usually when I came over there were shoes by the couch and Marcus's work bag by the stairs, and the general low-level mess of a house where 2 people actually lived. Tonight it was too clean, like she'd been straightening things up just to have something to do with her hands. I sat on the edge of the armchair by the window. She sat on the couch, pulled her knees up, and stared at the coffee table. "He said he was working late," she said. "Not to me exactly. More to the room." I didn't answer. "That's the 3rd Thursday this month." She finally looked up at me. "He didn't come home until after midnight the last 2 times. Said the Henderson account is in trouble and his whole team has been pulling extra hours." "Maybe it is," I said. "Careful." She gave me a look that said she'd already had that conversation with herself many times and was well past it. His team lead called the house last week," she said. "Looking for Marcus. Said he hadn't been responding to emails." She paused. "He told me they were all underwater with this account. That everyone was in the office around the clock." I felt something shift in the room a little. "Did you ask Marcus about it?" He said Jamie was confused about the timeline, that Jamie was actually the one dropping the ball and projecting it onto everyone else. She shook her head. He had an explanation ready before I finished the sentence. She reached over and picked up her phone from the couch cushion, looked at it, then put it face down on the table. "He's been doing that for months. Every time I bring something up, there's already an answer waiting. No hesitation. Just ready." She looked at the window. At first I thought I was being paranoid. "What do you think now?" I asked. She didn't answer right away. She just pressed her lips together and stared at some middle distance between us. "I think," she said slowly, "that I've been talking myself out of things I already know." I stayed quiet. "I found a receipt 2 weeks ago," she said, "in his coat pocket when I was taking it to the dry cleaner. A restaurant in Buckhead. A place called Luca. It's one of those smaller Italian spots, kind of quiet, not somewhere you go for a business dinner." She stopped. "He told me he'd never heard of it." "And you believed him?" "I wanted to." She looked at me directly then. "That's different from believing him." "You didn't know Marcus well." "Well enough to watch football with him a few times, borrow a drill, exchange the usual driveway conversation about the Falcons and the HOA and whether the weather was finally breaking." He'd always seemed decent to me. Easy to talk, good handshake, the kind of guy who remembered what you'd said 2 months ago and asked about it. I didn't know what to do with any of this. I don't know what you should do, I told her honestly. But you seem like you've already been carrying this for a while. He laughed again, quieter this time, more real. Yeah, a while. He made tea, which I didn't really want but didn't turn down because it gave us both something to do. She set a mug in front of me and wrapped both hands around hers and started talking more. Slowly at first, and then with this focused, deliberate energy, like she'd been holding the story in a sealed room and had finally found the door. He told me about the summer, how Marcus had started going to the gym at 6 a.m. 3 days a week, even though he'd never been a morning person in the entire time she'd known him. How he'd bought new cologne without mentioning it. How he'd started keeping his phone on silent and carrying it with him even to take out the trash. Small things individually, but stacked up they made a shape. She told me about the dinner with friends in September where he'd excused himself twice to take calls outside. When she asked later, he said it was his mother. But his mother, Diane pointed out flatly, had called the house line the following Sunday because she said Marcus hadn't been picking up his cell. I didn't say anything when he came home that night, Diane said, wrapping both hands tighter around the mug. I just sat with it. Why didn't you bring it up? Because every time I try, I sound crazy. He's good at that. She said it without bitterness, almost clinically, like she was describing a feature of something. He stays completely calm, looks at me like I'm exhausting him, gives me this expression. She looked down. After a while you start wondering if you actually are imagining things. That word again. Imagining. I thought of the way she'd said it, flat and practiced, like she'd been told it enough times that she'd learned to say it herself. I leaned back in the chair. You don't seem like someone who imagines things. She looked at me for a second, and something in her face shifted. That's the first time anyone said that to me in months. She said it quietly, not dramatically, just stated it. And somehow that made it worse. I ended up staying until almost 10. We talked about other things eventually, fell into easier conversation the way you do when the heaviest stuff has already been said, and you're both just waiting for the air to settle. She asked about my job. I asked about her sister in Nashville. It felt almost normal except for the undercurrent of everything she'd told me, sitting there between us like something that hadn't been put away yet. When I stood to leave, she walked me to the door. Right before I stepped out, she said, "Don't mention this to Ryan." Of course not. She nodded, looked down at her feet, then back up. I just needed to say it out loud to someone who wasn't going to tell me to pray about it or suggest couples therapy before I even know what I'm dealing with. I understand. She didn't smile exactly, but something in her expression loosened, just slightly. Thanks for bringing the jacket. I drove home and sat in my car for a few minutes in the driveway before going inside. I kept thinking about what she'd said, that she'd been talking herself out of things she already knew. And I thought about how much energy that must take, knowing something and choosing not to know it every single day. I figured that was the end of it, a one-time thing. She'd vented, I'd listened, life would go on. She texted me the next morning. It was nothing loaded, just, "Hey, thank you for last night, I mean it." I wrote back that she didn't have to thank me. She replied with a single thumbs up, and that was it. But then 3 days later, she texted again. Marcus had told her he was golfing with clients on Saturday. She'd looked at his golf bag in the garage, and the clubs were still there. She didn't ask me anything directly. She just said, "He's lying again. Not sure what to do with that." I sat with that message for about 20 minutes. Then I typed back, "Do you want to actually find out?" The 3 dots appeared and disappeared twice. Then yes. I don't know exactly when it stopped being about the jacket. Maybe it was that night when she said I was the first person to tell her she wasn't imagining things. Maybe it was earlier than that, back when she opened the door, and something in the way she looked at me made me slow down instead of leave. I don't know, dear. What I do know is that by Saturday morning, I was parked 2 blocks from their house with my car running. And when I saw Marcus pull out of the driveway in his Range Rover and head north, instead of south toward the Ansley Park course where he always played, I called Diane. She picked up on the first ring. "You went north," I said. "I know, I can see you from the window." I paused. "Are you coming?" 20 seconds later, she came out the side door in jeans and a blue pullover, got in my passenger seat, and pulled her seatbelt on without a word. We followed far enough back to stay invisible. Marcus drove like someone who wasn't thinking about being followed. Not checking mirrors. Not switching lanes unexpectedly. He stayed on 400 and got off near the perimeter, which had nothing to do with golf and nothing to do with clients. Diane sat with her hands loose in her lap and watched the road ahead of us. She didn't say much. When she did speak, it was quiet, even. He used to be a bad liar, she said at one point. In the beginning, he'd give too much detail, or his timing would be off and I'd always be able to tell. She paused. He's gotten a lot better. Marcus pulled into a hotel parking lot off Peachtree Dunwoody. A Marriott, mid-range, the kind of place that's nice enough to not feel gross, but anonymous enough to not be memorable. He parked toward the back, which was the kind of detail you didn't think about until you saw it. Diane was quiet for a long moment. That's not a golf course, she said. No. She kept her eyes on the spot where his car had stopped. Her breathing was steady, but her hands, which had been loose in her lap, were now pressed flat against her thighs. We don't have to go in, I said. She shook her head once. Not no, just setting something aside. If I leave now, I'll spend the rest of the weekend building a version of this in my head that might be worse than whatever's actually in there. I didn't argue with that. We walked into the lobby separately, which was her idea. She went in first, and I waited about 90 seconds before following. She was standing near the elevator bank looking at her phone, looking for all the world like someone waiting for a friend. I stood near the lobby bar and watched. She walked to the front desk, leaned on the counter in a way that looked relaxed and unhurried, and spoke to the woman behind it for maybe 45 seconds. Then she walked toward the elevator, pressed the button, and waited without looking back at me. I fell in beside her when the doors opened. He's here, she said quietly, looking straight ahead at the closing elevator doors. Checked in last night. Something about that detail was worse than all the rest. Last night. He'd been here since last night. What floor? I asked. She didn't tell me the room. But she hesitated before she looked at the screen. The elevator opened on the 4th floor and we walked the hall without talking. I wasn't sure what we were looking for, what we'd do if we found it. Whether any of this was going to give her what she actually needed. I think I knew, even then, that catching someone doesn't fix the part of you that already knew. We heard him before we found the room. His laugh, the easy, relaxed one I'd heard 100 times on someone's back deck with a beer in his hand. Coming from behind a door halfway down the hall, Diane stopped walking. That laugh, she said, not to me, just out loud. She stood there for a moment, and then moved forward and stopped outside the door. She didn't knock. She just stood there, one hand at her side, and waited. The door opened from the inside. Marcus stepped out holding his room key, already talking to someone behind him, mid-sentence smiling. He saw Diane and his whole face went still. Not guilty exactly, not right away. More like a man who had been moving through a world where this particular moment was not supposed to exist, and now had to recalibrate. Then he saw me standing 2 feet behind her. The woman in the room appeared a second later. She was maybe 30, in jeans, and a cream-colored blouse, hair down. She took one look at Diane and understood everything immediately, the way people do when there's nothing else it could be. Nobody spoke for what felt like a full 5 seconds. Diane said, very calmly, "Tell me again about the Henderson account." Marcus opened his mouth and closed it. He looked at me once more like I was the part he couldn't locate in any version of the story he was trying to build. Diane. He said her name like it was the beginning of a sentence, but there was no sentence behind it. Don't, she said. Just that one word. He stopped. I'm not going to stand in a hotel hallway and listen to you try to explain this, she said. Her voice wasn't shaking. It wasn't loud. It was the tone of someone who had already done their grieving in the car on the way over, and was now just handling logistics. I'm going to go home. And you're going to have to decide what you want to do next. She didn't wait for him to respond. She turned and walked back toward the elevator, steady, unhurried, like she was leaving a meeting that had run long, and she had somewhere else to be. I followed. Marcus called her name once from down the hall. She didn't turn around. The elevator doors closed behind us, and neither of us said anything. I watched the floor numbers change. When we got to the lobby, she walked straight through it and out to the parking lot and didn't stop until she reached my car. She stood on the passenger side, with her hand on the roof, and looked out over the parking lot for a moment. Her shoulders dropped on a long exhale, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and doesn't quite empty everything out, but gets close. "You. I thought I was going to fall apart in there," she said. "I kept waiting for it." "You didn't?" She shook her head slowly. "No." She looked down at the roof of the car, then back up. "I just felt clear." She said it like she was testing the word, making sure it fit. Like the fog finally lifted. "I know that sounds stupid given what we just walked into." "It doesn't sound stupid." She looked at me then, and in the gray afternoon light of a hotel parking lot in December, she looked completely different from the person who had opened her front door 3 weeks ago. Still tired. Still sad underneath everything. But present in a way she hadn't been before, like she'd finally stopped fighting to stay in a story that was never going to end the way she needed. "What do I do now?" she asked. Not desperate, just honest. "I think you call a lawyer," I said. "On Monday, and I think you don't do anything else until then." She nodded once, slowly. Then she opened the car door and got in. We drove back mostly in silence. She looked out the window at the highway and I kept my eyes on the road, and we didn't try to fill it with anything. There wasn't anything to fill it with. Everything that needed to be said had been said, and everything that was going to happen next was going to take time, and neither of us was pretending otherwise. When I pulled up to her house, she sat there for a moment before getting out. "How do you feel?" I asked. She thought about it genuinely, like it was a real question deserving a real answer. "Tired," she said, "and honest, which I haven't felt in a long time." She looked over at me. "Thank you for coming with me. You didn't have to do that." "I know." She looked like she was about to say something else, and then decided against it. She pushed the car door open, stepped out, and then turned back once. "I'm going to be okay," she said. Not a question, not reassurance. Just a fact she was stating out loud for the first time, like hearing it in her own voice made it more real. She went inside. I waited until the front door closed behind her, before I pulled away. I drove home slower than usual. The city looked the same as it always did. Same streets, same lights turning red and green, same people moving through their Friday evenings, without knowing anything about anyone else's. I thought about Marcus sitting in that hotel hallway with nowhere to go. I thought about Diane sitting in her quiet house with all that space to herself. I thought about how a lie doesn't end when it's discovered. It just changes shape, becomes something you carry differently. I hadn't planned any of it. I went to return a jacket and ended up inside someone else's life. Standing in a hotel corridor in the middle of a Saturday I'd expected to spend doing absolutely nothing. None of it was supposed to happen that way. But I thought about what she'd said in the car, driving away from the hotel. Clear. Like the fog finally lifted. And I thought that was probably the most honest thing either of us had said in the entire 3 weeks since I knocked on her door. Some things can't stay hidden forever. Most of the time they don't even make it, as long as the person hiding them thinks they will. And when it all finally lands, it doesn't look like a dramatic breakdown in a hotel hallway. It looks like a woman, in a blue pullover, who stopped waiting to feel like she was losing her mind and started trusting what she already knew. I keep thinking about the moment Diane said the word clear. Not happy, not healed, just clear. And I think that word says more about what actually happened that night, and everything after it, than anything else I could put on it. Marcus didn't lose everything because he got caught in a hotel hallway. He lost it long before that. He lost it the first time he chose to lie instead of face something hard, and then again every single time after that, when it became easier to keep lying than to stop. That's how it usually works. Not one big collapse, but 100 small decisions that each feel survivable on their own, until suddenly they aren't. The receipt in his coat pocket. The story about Jamie that didn't hold up. The second charger in his car. None of those things were the problem. They were just the shape the problem made when it finally got too big to hide. I think about Diane sitting across from me at that kitchen table, both hands wrapped around a mug, laying out months of details that she'd been carrying alone. What strikes me now is how much of her energy had been going toward doubting herself. Not toward solving the problem, not toward getting out, just toward talking herself out of what she already knew was true. That's what a sustained lie does to the person on the receiving end of it. It doesn't just deceive them. It makes them question their own judgment, their own perception, their own right to trust what they see. Watching her work through that, and then watching her walk out of that hotel lobby, with her shoulders back and her breathing steady, I understood something I hadn't before. Clarity isn't the same as being okay. It's just the beginning of being able to move. What she did took something real. It would have been easier to keep accepting the explanations, keep smoothing things over, keep choosing the version of her life that required the least immediate pain. A lot of people do that, not because they're weak, but because the alternative is so uncertain. But Diane didn't turn away from what she already knew. She followed it. She sat with the discomfort of not being sure and kept paying attention anyway, kept asking questions, kept trusting that the truth was worth finding, even when finding it was going to hurt. That's not a small thing. That takes the kind of honesty with yourself that most people spend years avoiding. And I think about my own role in all of it. I went over to return a jacket. I didn't have a plan, didn't have any particular courage, didn't set out to help anyone. I just slowed down when I probably should have kept walking, and then I kept showing up because it felt wrong not to. I don't think that makes me a hero in this story. But I think it matters, the choice to stay present when someone is carrying something alone and could use one person who isn't going to flinch. Keep doing. That's something I want to keep moments, but in the ordinary ones, where it's easier to mind your own business. What stayed with me most, driving home that night, was this. Every person in that story made choices, and every choice had a consequence that followed it as naturally as one step follows the next. Marcus chose deception and ended up with nothing to stand on. Diane chose honesty with herself, even when it was painful, and ended up with clarity she hadn't had in years. I chose to stay instead of leave and ended up understanding something about what it means to actually be someone's witness. None of it was dramatic. None of it was complicated. It was just people making choices, and then living in what those choices built. That's the part that doesn't go away.